Hello, my name's Oluwatimi Osha. Today I want to discuss the issue of fraudsters who have been infiltrating our public sector. Of course, if you check the news, it's replete with stories of people who had falsified their credentials, and they're under investigation. And ironically, they're working in positions of authority, significant responsibility, sometimes even in classified areas in the US public sector, right? Most recently, there's been the story of a guy called David Rush, who, until recently, until he was discovered, was a senior executive, a member of the senior executive service in the CIA, right? He was in the CIA where he'd been for about 17 years. Um, so it was discovered that his credentials were all falsified, right? All the credentials he claimed were all fabricated, and he'd been passing the government vetting process for almost 2 decades, right? And he even made it all the way to a senior executive position. I'll explain the senior executive position. The senior executive service position is the highest level in the US federal civil service. It was created during the Carter administration, President Jimmy Carter. And so the senior executives, they're the most prestigious level. They're the leaders of the US federal civil service. And they make as much as they can make, as much as the vice president of the United States. So they make a lot of money, which is, up to $289,400, right? Apart from the money, the authority they have. So Carter mapped them, right, made them the senior executive service to be equivalent to generals, like flag officers, general officers, that's generals in the US Army, right? So the lowest, the starting SES is mapped to a brigadier general. There's a major general level. There's a lieutenant general level, and so on and so forth. But by the way, they're civilians, right? They're civilians. They're not military people. But the authority, they have the authority of equivalent authority uh, of 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 generals in the U.S. Army, right? So, but they're civilians and they lead the civilian workforce. So, uh, they're the most prestigious, the leaders of the United States federal civil service, right? Um, so you can imagine this guy who didn't have the credentials, didn't have the qualifications, but was passing all the vetting, the background checks in the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, prestigious premier, intelligence outfit, right? And they couldn't catch him, right? I'll do another video discussing this guy, David Rush. He held a TSSCI, top secret SCI, uh, clearance. I hold a TSSCI as well. Again, that's the highest level of national security clearance that an American can have, right? So it requires like really rigorous vetting. But you see, the Russians, the Mossad, all these competing intelligence agencies will just be laughing. They'll be laughing at America. Well, the thing is, another thing they have to check, is he a mole, right? Is this guy a mole? Was he a sleeper agent? He was there for 17 years. Of course, he's under arrest right now. But in significantly apart from the falsification of his credentials, there are other things they found as well. So I'm going to do a separate video discussing this guy because there's this funny connection that he has. When he became, when he joined the CIA, around 2009, falsifying his credentials, right? He Prior to that, he'd worked in the Navy, but a very low tier level in the Navy Reserve, right? And that's another loophole that's been used, right? I don't want to digress, but I have something to say about the loophole of the military, right? How it's a backdoor into the federal civil service, and it shouldn't be because it just allows unqualified people. I think we should reward people who've worked in the military, but really, I'm somebody who thinks all Americans, right? There should be a mandatory service, military service that all Americans do for a year or 2 years, and stop giving unnecessary benefits to people just because they were in the military, right? It's really it's really diluting. It's diminishing the quality of skills we have in the federal government. It's significantly impairing it, right? And the back door they use is the military, right? People who go to military academies like West Point, they're supremely qualified. They're very brilliant people. But there are many people. There was a time that the U.S. government would hire criminals, right? Would take criminals in, recruit criminals in uh, into the military, right? So that their criminal record could be expunged, or they could avoid jail or whatever. And so you see that there are people who are not. Yes, the military makes something of people, but look, there are other people. We need talent in America, right? And sometimes the people not so talented, they they use the military as a backdoor to get into the civil service, and they're really, really attenuating the quality of talent in the civil service. But that's another discussion, right? I think everybody should do military service, right? To be fair to all Americans, or everybody should do military service, because you'll be creating a patrician class of people just because they served in the military, who don't deserve it, right? The era of the aristocracy is gone, right? That was how it was back then in Europe. And so, the military, people who serve in the military are trying to create some kind of you know, um, unethical, uh, corrupt system in America. They're entrenching. Their families get hired in the Pentagon. Their wives, it's ridiculous what's going on, the corruption, and this is why this guy David Rush could get in. First of all, he was just in the reserves, so he never even went into combat or anything. But they get in just for a paycheck, right? I was working with somebody who's doing that as well. The person was already in the civil service, but she told me because she wanted to get an extra paycheck, she joins the Naval Reserve, right? That's all they're doing. So they're just gaming the system, defrauding the United States government, and the excuse they're using, the loophole is uh, the fig leaf is the military. But in any event, so this guy David Rush joins in the he joins the Navy Reserves. He was working in a very low position as a systems technician or whatever, right? Um, and then he applies for the government, Federal Civil Service, CIA. Eventually, he tries, fails, fails, fails. Eventually, he gets in with a fabricated resume, completely fabricated. But he uses this resume, and he sails through, becomes a director, right, of a directorate within the CIA. That he's a senior executive member of the senior executive service in the CIA. Claimed he went to Clemson University, had a bachelor's in engineering, false. Master's in engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic, false, right? And all these Navy pilots, all these that he was a Navy aviator. So the highest level he got to in the Navy was lieutenant. He fabricated his resume that he was a Navy captain, fabricated all sorts of trainings, credentials. None of it was true. But how did this guy get through the vetting process? And of the CIA, how did he make it through? I'm going to have a discussion on that. The thing is, this guy made it through because there was somebody on the inside, somebody in the CIA HR that was helping him, that was passing him through, right? So somebody at the top. And usually you'll find that it's interesting. Um, Somebody who was actually the principal HR executive in the CIA at the time was one Dr. Mary C. Byers. She was the principal CIA director when he got into the CIA, right? In 2009. She was a member of the senior executive service. So I think she would have overseen that at the time. And it's interesting that I noticed that she retired or resigned, just left a position as director of human capital at the Pentagon, in the at the office of the Undersecretary for Defense in intelligence. I was offered a position there. I was prevented from starting, by the way, um, and she just left this May. And she's looking for work in the private sector. I found it very interesting. I found it very interesting. I know of this woman. I don't know her personally because she was supposed to have been helping me when I had an issue as a McCain fellow, right? Somebody committed fraud and I reported it and I was retaliated against. And she was one, she offered me $5,000 to voluntarily resign or something. At some point, she also told me, even though I had recourse, right? She told me I had no recourse. So she made some false statements, some false claims, right? I don't know if it would have been intentional because she'd been in HR for so long. She was an executive. She knew what she was telling me was false. So one of the concerning things is that there's a racket, a ring within HR of in the federal government. So somebody high up is the one who's allowing these things. Uh, but I'm going to discuss that later on. So apart from that, though, apart from this guy, you find out that one of the reasons that they're able to get through is because somebody high up who is in HR, they're probably sleeping with them, right? They probably having sex with somebody in HR. Like there's a case of a former Navy Auditor General, the Auditor General of the Navy. His name's Ronnie Booth, right? It was discovered, and he retired once they started an investigation. But it's public information. It's out there now. This was prior to me becoming an auditor in the Navy, right? But I read the report on him because Congress ordered an investigation. It turns out that this guy, this is what they claimed, the report of the investigations, right? It says that this guy was having sex or quid pro quo. When you say quid pro quo, that means, you're giving something in exchange of something. And in the federal government, it's understood that it's sex, right? Sex for play, that they're taking sex from you. It's not necessarily sex, it could be money. But when they say quid pro quo, in the terms of EOC, that's normally what they're referring to. So at somebody in a position of responsibility, position of authority, they're extorting sex from someone so that they can promote them, so that they can hire them. And so they said, this guy, this former Auditor General of the Navy, Ronnie Booth, who incidentally was the first black person to become Auditor General of the Navy, was a black guy. Now, from our report of investigation, it said that this guy was actually extorting sex from subordinates for 2 decades. 2 decades, and nobody caught on, and he rose all the way to be Auditor General of the Navy. How unlikely is that he could have been doing something, right? And yeah, apparently everybody knew without him being reprimanded, censured, or removed. Because first of all, the public service, again, it's public trust. There's standards as a requirement of integrity, honesty for you to be in the civil service, in the public service, in the U.S. government, right? Any public sector, whether it's state, whether it's federal. You take an oath, if you're in the federal government, you take an oath to the U.S. Constitution that you follow our laws, you don't break the laws. So you protect it, you're defending it against all enemies, domestic and foreign. You have a requirement, whistleblower requirement to report fraud, waste, abuse, mismanagement. If you come in contact with it, you know that you have to be above board, right? Uh, you can't be dishonest. Those are requirements. That's a basic requirement for being a public servant in the U.S. government. But people like this guy, Roddy Booth, apparently was using his authority for 20 years. They said the excuse he'd use was that, well, he was mentoring someone, right? He was mentoring a female. was coaching them, and that he'd use it to extort sex in exchange for promoting them, right, or them keeping their jobs, right? For 20 years, how unlikely that black men are scrutinized extremely. They're placed on, they're placed under a microscope, right? And the way they're examined, they're vetted. It's extraordinary, at least in my own case, for instance. I'm talking about credentials. Like, let me put it out there, my own credentials, right? It's clear. My credentials, I hold a Doctor of Law, Juris Doctor degree from George Washington University. I hold an MBA, that's Master of Business Administration in accounting, with accounting undergraduates from Troy University, right, in Troy, Alabama. I hold a bachelor's from Columbia University, the Ivy League, right? I have other degrees as well. I don't need to mention those. I've studied overseas at Oxford University. I did international human rights law there, a program there. I studied at Bocconi University in Milan, Italy. I was an intellectual property law fellow there. So my credentials are out there, easy to verify them, right? Not just my transcript. So apparently, this guy, David Rush, had fabricated transcripts. But the vetting process, especially for the TSSCI, it's so rigorous. They're going to go to the schools, they do all sorts of backgrounds. And the fact is, each time they have a period that they're going to check you again, right? They're going to recheck, they're going to re examine, reinvestigate, right? How did this guy make it through for almost 2 decades? And he didn't just make it through, he got into to become a senior executive, which is the highest. You go through an extreme vetting process. It's interesting that this Dr. Mary Byers was actually on the committee for vetting on the panel, because there's a panel. She'd been on the panel because I looked up her background, her resume, and she put it out there. She'd been on the panel for the senior executive service. She's on the panel, one of the people. So, the funny thing is, these people, they let in their friends and they pass them through. In fact, when I say let in their friends, there's a case of another guy. He's late now, he's deceased, but this guy was also a member of the senior executive service. He was a top senior research scientist in the Air Force, right? He was for for jets, rockets, right? He was building rockets, and he worked for the federal government. This guy did something so crazy, man. And he was never charged. Well, he died before he could be charged. The circumstances surrounding his death is unclear. He passed in 2021. But this guy, his name is Jim Gord. He had a prostitute, someone he was sleeping with. He would go overseas. He met her, a prostitute he was sleeping with. And he was married. He'd been married for 30 years, but he had this prostitute he was sleeping with. And he would use US government credit cards. They give you government credit cards if you're a certain level, you have a certain position in the US government. Before I was swatted, I'd just been approved, cleared for a US government credit card. I didn't get to use it because I was swatted. I was, falsely, there was a false flag operation after I had reported fraud of my boss. And, that's another story. I've done videos discussing that. So there's so much corruption in the US federal government because people we give positions of trust to, they're not above board. Like this Jim Gord guy. So Jim Gord was using his government credit card to pay a prostitute $400 an hour. $400 an hour was what he was charging, billing the U.S. government, U.S. taxpayers, right? Using his government credit card. So his wife wouldn't know. Because he was married, he was putting money for a prostitute on his U.S. government credit card. But he not only does that, he now gets a contractor, U.S. government contractor, that he was approving. Who gets to build stuff for the U.S. government, right? Supply stuff, build stuff for the U.S. government. Because U.S. government, we don't build anything, right? We outsource it to private sector, right? When I say outsource, I don't mean foreign, right? I mean within the US, domestic. So the public sector doesn't build it, the government doesn't build it. It's, you know, it contracts it to a private company, for instance, just like the government. They contract Boeing, or Raytheon, whatever, to build jets or whatever for us, and rockets, missiles, stuff like that. So there was this contractor, the CEO, the head of, was his friend. This guy was from Bangladesh. So he got him, he fabricates a resume for this prostitute. Okay, I don't know if prostitute is not a good name. Maybe they call them sex workers. Maybe it sounds more pleasant. So she's a sex worker, fabricates a resume for her and calls her an expert scientist. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. Sorry. I have a slight cold. Summer, funny, I have a cold in summer. But I guess it's allergies. But so he fabricates this resume for his for this woman, and she's a contractor. He calls her, no, he wants to make her a contractor. So he gets this contractor to hire, he pressures him to hire this woman. He's saying she's a top scientist. They find out, so over time, by the time it's entering a year, the company finds out, the contractor, government contractor found out that this woman can't work. And she was really doing work for the federal government, right? Because you can be a contractor and you're going into the Pentagon in different places, classified areas. So he put her on as co-chair of a panel that reviewed um, jet propulsion engines, rockets, and things like that. This woman, apparently, she was a prostitute. She didn't have any credentials, nothing, right? No university degree, nothing. But he falsified her resume, and the government is paying for her until this guy, uh, the CEO of the contracting company, by the way, was from Bangladesh, and then he approached Jim Gordon, the government official, the top research scientist, right? He approaches her that, look, this woman doesn't seem up to snuff, right? She doesn't seem to have any credentials or whatever. So the guy, Jim Gordon, eventually admits to the guy that, okay, she's really a prostitute. So this guy wants to go and report, but Jim Gordon now threatens him that he's going to bring out his guns because Jim Gordon's a white guy, and then he tells the guy not to report because nobody's going to report him because he's an old, insinuating that one, he's a white guy, member of the old boys club, and this guy's just an immigrant there because he's from Bangladesh, and and then he now cuts the contract. He cuts the contract from the Bangladeshi guy, from the whistleblower's intended whistleblower. Well, he's a whistleblower because he's reported it, right? He cuts the contract to his company. Anyway, long and short of it is this guy, he dies before there's an official investigation, so he's never charged. The woman resigned, abruptly, and but the matter got out there and the government investigated and put it out there, public information. But the guy died. I don't know if he committed, I don't know how the circumstances of his death. I will probably look into it and discuss further. But this is, you know so like I was saying, that you see there's some kind of it's somebody that has a position of authority in the government, that's an insider, that allows the passing off of fraudulent credentials, unqualified people who aren't supposed to be there to be able to get into the government in the first place. And usually it's some kind of quid pro quo that's going on. I was qualified and I got into the federal government. And within the federal government, more than one person tried to uh, start a quid pro quo relationship with me. When I reported it, I was retaliated against and it threatened my position, right? And this whole false flag that I've been talking about in Maryland, um, an investigator who's looked into it has said, look, it's all related to my reporting, what happened in the federal government. The false flag operation, the false charges I'm facing in Maryland, ostensibly it's supposed to be from Maryland. Like it has nothing to do with my job, but it's that's a fabrication, right? Um, it was it's really from people who are backing the senior executives that I reported, because these senior executives are very powerful, right? You see, they have this uh, old boy network, right? They're white people, they have these connections, or even those that are black or whatever, they have these connections, and they can they can be violent. They have connections in law enforcement amongst judges. They can be violent, right? And Americans just have to speak out more on it. You see, there's the situation of Ian Roberts. He calls himself doctor. Apparently, this guy, he falsified his credentials. He doesn't have a PhD from anywhere, even though he lied. He lied that he had an MBA from MIT, was a lie. That he had a master's from Georgetown, it was a lie. He has 2 degrees from unimpressive schools, but no PhD, nothing. But he continues to call himself Dr. Ian Roberts. I'm talking about the guy from Guyana. He's been sentenced now and is in prison, right? He's in prison. He took a plea deal, so he's doing 2 years in prison, and his lawyer say he's going to be deported after that. That's Ian Roberts, who the guy from Guyana, who lied that he was an American citizen when he was not even an American citizen, but he was in the position of he was working as superintendent of Des Moines public schools in Iowa, right up until the time he was caught in 2025. But he's been doing this for over 20 years, been working in public schools in different jurisdictions. He worked in New York City public schools. He worked in Baltimore public schools. He worked in the DC public schools as a principal. He worked in Pennsylvania public schools, where he was a township something, where he was a he had actually been a superintendent as well. What is it called? Township Creek or something in Pennsylvania, Erie, Pennsylvania. He was superintendent, and the last position he held until he was arrested by ICE because he there was a deportation or whatever removal order, and he was fleeing when he was arrested. And initially, there was this rancor. Everybody was up in arms and protesting ICE abuse, ICE, and all that stuff. Meanwhile, this guy actually had a criminal record, and he fought. To claim that you're a United States citizen when you're not is actually a criminal offense, right? And it will prevent you from actually becoming a citizen. So it's ironic that there are many people who can't find jobs, young people who've graduated from college who can't find jobs, and there are people who are not qualified in the system who are fabricating their credentials, like Ian Roberts, like um, like David Rush, and they're making it all the way to executive positions. Ian Roberts, who was not even an American citizen, didn't have a PhD, didn't have the masters, all these things he was claiming he had. He was making $286,000 as superintendent of public schools, right? $286,000. Prior to that, he was somewhere else, superintendent in Pennsylvania. He was making about 270,000, making serious money, right? Uh, so many people, the thing is, follow the process, right? Especially in the public sector, right? The public sector, there's an honesty requirement. But what I'm saying is, these people, they can't make it on their own. They can't pass off falsified information on their own. The vetting, the background check, without an insider. There's an insider who's helping them. And usually they have a quid pro quo situation, like they're sleeping with an insider, right? Like the case of Jim Gord, who was a top research scientist in the Air Force, right? Is sleeping with them. They're having sex with them. That's what's going on. Like the case of the Auditor General of the Navy. Now, what's ironic is some of the people that former Auditor General of the Navy, the Booth guy that he slept with, they're still there. They're still there. And the person requesting sex and the person receiving, giving the sex, you know, they shouldn't be in the public sector. They shouldn't be there, right? The person who gave it, because one, you're an adult, they can't force you, and there's an ethic, there's a moral responsibility. There are many women who make it to the top, who make it, men and women, without having to sell themselves, without having to use quid pro quo, submit to quid pro quo. So it's an insult to those people who work hard, use their credentials, get the credentials. It's just an insult. It's abusive. It's a violation of not just our, the integrity of our system, but it violates Americans as well. I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll continue and discuss further the case of David Rush. My name is Oluro Timiosha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.